Hello, everybody. Very delighted to meet you, distinguished guest, dear honored speaker, Dr. Henri Hardy. I'm pronouncing it in French, sorry. It's my honor to welcome you to the 2020 South Berlin lecture. I know that we will conclude this webinar richer in knowledge than when we start. Thank you, Dr. Hardy, for accepting our invitation and for enlightening us. Some times ago, I asked Lord John, our President of Honor and an active member of Liberal International within the Bureau, to help us in developing a new narrative which will make liberal values more inclusive and accessible to people all around the world. I would like to take this occasion to thank my friend Lord John for the work he has done in this regard and for inviting such an eminent writer and editor of Ishaq Berlin. Dear friends, dear all, liberal democracy around the world is under threat. The waves of democratization of the 18th and 19th have stalled. Democracies from Hungary to Turkey and Poland to the Philippines are backsliding. Autocracies such as China, Russia are attempting to undermine democracies from within and beyond their borders. In the United States, democratic institutions face an unprecedented series of threats from the very leaders chosen to safeguard democracy. The threats to multilateralism and freedom give us more than one reason to worry about the numerous violations of human rights. More than love of power, extremism and radicalism are questioning multiculturalism, spreading division and hate, and undermining peace around the world. Today, COVID-19 is used by many so-called strong men to take more power while the threats to our democracies are exacerbated. Liberals have shown throughout history that they are the ones who are open to new ideas and new thoughts. With this freedom of expression and thought, we have made the world better. And today, with humility, we will deepen our thoughts to build a more human world. Today, more than ever, we want our voice to reach around the world. We are working to make liberal international member parties better connected, but also we are working to open ourselves up to the world. Our aim is to build a strong movement together and to lobby for dignity anywhere in the world. Today, we will have the exceptional opportunity to listen to you and to engage with you, Dr. Henri Hardy, on the subject of Ishaq Berlin and how we can relate to events we see around us today. Dr. Hardy, you are the best qualified person to address this topic. It is essential for liberals everywhere in the world to reconnect with the wisdom of past liberal figures such as Ishaq Berlin from time to time, in order to inform a successful course to a just future. And I am pleased that we can take a significant step forward together on this project today. You will certainly inspire us and help liberals and Democrats better understand the abuses that have transpired and what we liberals Democrats can do to protect our values and to build a world where all of us we can progress. Thank you so much and for accepting our invitation, and I will now give the floor to my friend, Lord John.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President. And as you say, it's a great delight for us to have Dr. Henry Hardy with us. And I now turn the podium over to him.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for your kind words. Isaiah Berlin, on occasions like this, used always to say, You've given me much more than my due, but it's much more pleasant to receive more than your due than to receive your due. So with him, I say the same. Who was Isaiah Berlin, and why is he important today, almost a quarter of a century after his death? Berlin was a Russian Jewish thinker from the city of Riga. Riga is now the capital of Latvia, but was under Russian rule when Berlin was born there in 1909. His father was a timber merchant, and his mother was an aspiring opera singer. From 1916 to 1920, his family lived in Petrograd, as St. Petersburg was then called. In 1921, when Berlin was 11, they emigrated to England to escape Bolshevism and anti-Semitism. Berlin rapidly became more English than the English, but all his life he identified himself as a Russian Jew. He went on to enjoy an illustrious professional career as an Oxford academic and a public intellectual. He had a formidable personal reputation as a talker and as a connoisseur of people. His professional field was first philosophy and then the history of ideas. He also wrote brilliantly in wonderful essays and letters about his contemporaries, about politics, about music, about literature. In short, about all human life. He died in Oxford in 1997. Humanity was Berlin's constant theme. He was a wise and eloquent interpreter of human nature. He was an exemplar of humanity himself in one of its best forms, and a mesmerizing presence in person. He was excited by ideas and made them exciting for others. He discussed the deepest, most general human issues, which are of concern to all of us. What should we be? What should we do? How should we live? He wrote without jargon in lucid English. All this makes him a powerfully attractive and significant figure. He insisted above all on the central importance of our freedom of choice. By making choices, we forge our own identities, rather than following the herd. He defended the political freedom that allows us to be free people. He celebrated the inescapable but glorious multiplicity of human goals, values, and cultures. He opposed any attempt to reduce all our goals to one common denominator, all values to one super value, such as happiness or usefulness. He rejected the claim that everyone should participate, still less be forced to participate, in a single worldwide form of life which claims to answer all moral questions with unambiguous certainty. All such projects for him are radically mistaken and lead to disaster. In every human sphere, he was an enthusiast for openness, variety, and complexity. He was hostile to oppression and oversimplification, especially in its authoritarian and totalitarian forms. If liberalism is today on the defensive, Berlin is one of its most convincing and articulate defenders. His ideas are increasingly relevant and urgent in our own time. Globalization and migration are not homogenizing forces. They uncover and exacerbate the ethical differences that split humanity. They bring to the center of the stage exactly those issues of multiculturalism and mutual cultural tolerance that Berlin illuminated. I don't want to exaggerate his merits. He wasn't a saint or a genius in a narrow philosophical sense, but his legacy of insights and ideas is exceedingly fertile. To reduce them to 10 commandments is ludicrous, but I hope provocative. Most of the commandments are related to each other because they emerge from a vision of human life that infuses them all. Of course, the idea that Berlin issued any commandments, let alone 10 of them, is just a mnemonic intended to summarize some of the lessons we can take from his prolific writings. The first commandment makes clear that it shouldn't be taken literally. Here it is. Number 1, thou shalt neither issue nor obey commandments. For Berlin, the first question of politics is, why should anyone obey anyone else? Note that crucial word, should. It's totally different to ask, why does anyone obey anyone else? The answer to that question might be because if they don't, they will suffer or die. Sheer power always plays a leading role in politics, but even the powerful seek to justify their power and the use they make of it. People are more likely to obey if they are given persuasive reasons why they should obey, over and above the threat of force. And giving reasons for and against obedience is the beginning of political philosophy. Because it searches for reasons, political philosophy is at odds with the unquestioning acceptance of authority. We should not blindly comply with commands, especially unreasonable ones, simply because they issue from a source that must not be challenged. A classic example of this kind of blind obedience for Berlin was Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac when God required this, even though killing one's offspring is normally an especially heinous sin. Berlin wrote about this in a letter. Abraham fully believed that if need be, he had to sacrifice his son, and that is the whole point of the trial, as it's called, that what the Lord commands has to be done, no matter how deeply it offends against natural morality. That is what religion dictates. Direct orders from on high must be obeyed, no matter what they are. Berlin couldn't accept this form of obedience for himself. I was never favored by this act of total commitment, he wrote, which I think Jehovah surely demands. So although the story of Abraham and Isaac may be moving, even noble, the principle of obedience which underlies it is one that Berlin rejects. This matters today because it isn't a principle that has disappeared into the mists of history. It's alive and well in our own time. It's alive and well in countries ruled by authoritarian governments, especially communist or Islamist ones. These regimes expect and enforce conformity to rules that are often deeply unreasonable and that defy our common humanity. Where political totalitarians or absolutist theocratic rulers hold sway, dissent and argument are repressed in favor of slavish adherence to the dictates of the leaders. The best or worst example of the religious variant of authoritarianism in the world today is provided by extremist political Islamism, now that the authority of Christianity has declined. The political variant is rife in many parts of the world that live under dictatorships of one stripe or another. It is also present in the doctrinaire factionalism of much of our own political wisdom, which expects unthinking compliance with the party line. Extremists from both left and right substitute thuggery and direct action, mindless self-righteous threats and abuse for the civilized and open-minded democratic debate, majority decision-making, compromise, tolerance, and moderation that Berlin championed. Unexciting virtues Berlin conceded, but the right ones all the same. Commandment 2. Thou shalt not espouse a single vision of life as uniquely true. This commandment rejects one of the foundations on which illiberal regimes are based. It repudiates all claims to have discovered a definitive, universally correct code of human conduct from which the right course of action can be read off as if from a handbook. The reason why no such handbook should or could ever be written is that human needs and desires, goals and principles are multiple, various, and often in conflict with one another. By our nature, we pursue a wide variety of objectives, which can't be arranged in a fixed order of priority. They can't be fitted together to provide an authoritative, coherent, systematic guide to action, which applies in any circumstances. Each goal makes its own distinctive demands, which sometimes clash with the demands made by other goals. For example, liberty clashes with equality. Liberty for the wolves is death for the lambs, as Berlin put it. And order clashes with spontaneity. When a clash like this happens, there is no unquestionable way of measuring one goal against the other in order to decide which one to prioritize and how far. How important a particular goal is to an individual or to a society depends on the overall outlook of which it forms a part and on the specific context in which it comes up for consideration. My decision may differ from yours, but neither may be wrong. A Japanese decision may differ from a Javanese one. Choices have to be made, and when they are made, there can be a tragic loss because the goal that is not chosen is left unachieved. So, we must reject any claim to have answered the basic moral questions of human life. There is no final solution for us to discover. Instead, there is a permanent need for balancing contradictory claims, for careful trade-offs between conflicting values, for toleration of difference. We have to consider the specific factors at play when a choice is needed, and not rely on a universal abstract blueprint that claims to apply everywhere, always, to everyone. Berlin passionately rejects such panaceas. He writes, "Few things have done more harm than the belief on the part of individuals or groups or tribes or states or nations or churches that he or she or they are in sole possession of the truth, especially about how to live, what to be and do, and that those who differ from them are not merely mistaken, but wicked or mad, and need restraining or suppressing. It is a terrible and dangerous arrogance to believe that you alone are right, have a magical eye which sees the truth, and that others cannot be right if they disagree." Unfortunately, human beings can't help looking for such universal answers, whether religious or political, and the battle against them will never be over. The belief in a single answer to moral questions Berlin calls monism, as against pluralism, which is his term for the more truthful attitude which he champions. Our main political parties show the traces of monism in their very names. Conservatism prioritizes traditional political and economic structures at the expense of reform. Labour focuses on the interests of one portion of the population at the expense of the rest. For me, one attraction of the Liberal Democrats is that their name and identity are more to do with the way in which political decisions are made than with particular substantive policies. But perhaps this is also part of the explanation of their poor performance at the polls, because fair procedures are less inspiring to voters than exciting partisan reforms. This admittedly somewhat simplistic reflection on party names may be tendentious, but a political movement that favours one interest group to the exclusion of another is touched by monism and can't easily command the consensus required for stable government. Commandment number 3. Thou shalt always be an explorer first, a missionary second. Because no vision of life can be uniquely true, no such vision can reasonably urge, still less force, on those who don't share it. This is what missionaries do. I mean missionaries for both religious and political systems, which may not be transplantable into places where traditions are very different. Because of this, the first step when encountering an unfamiliar outlook is to do one's best to understand it in its own terms. This may cure the potential missionary of the desire to impose an alien system. But to understand is not always to forgive, and empathy has its limits. All the same, to go blindly in with all guns blazing, taking no account of long-established viewpoints unlike one's own, is dangerous and stupid. This is one of the most important lessons of pluralism, which can turn missionaries into explorers, terrorists into diplomats, despots into democrats. Number 4, thou shalt always respect our common humanity. We should reject not only monist views, but also views that defy or deny human nature. Otherwise, anything goes, which is a predicament often called subjectivism or relativism, and can be a license for inhuman behavior. There will always be dispute about what the basic requirements of humanity are, but even if we can't agree on all of them, we may be able to agree on some. Again, for Berlin, the most basic human attribute is freedom of choice, the ability and the need to form our own identities and lives by choosing freely among the options open to us, deciding for ourselves what to be and do, how to live, without interference by others. Any attempt to constrict that freedom, to compel needless obedience, to enslave people to an ideology, is a degradation and denial of their humanity. And the ultimate source and touchstone of morality is the individual, not the collective, let alone the unknowable divine. This is why we must resist paternalistic despotisms such as communism. If the Chinese government argues, for example, that certain human rights are a local Western matter and form no part of Oriental culture, we are right to refuse to accept this. These are human rights, not Western rights. Humans everywhere need certain rights in order to reach their full potential as human beings. Commandment number 5. Thou shalt never unnecessarily restrict any individual's freedom of choice. The protection of individual freedom is the foundation of liberalism, as its name makes plain. According to Berlin, once more, the most basic freedom we need and possess is freedom of the will, freedom of choice. And hot on its heels comes the political liberty of non-interference. This is called negative liberty because it is based on an injunction not to impede anyone. Again, individuals must be allowed to make their own decisions, not dictated to about how they should live their lives. Of course, there are exceptions, many of them, but the onus of proof is on those who would curtail freedom. John Stuart Mill's formulation of the principle of negative liberty is well known. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. This principle is routinely broken by authoritarian rulers of various stripes. Authoritarian or totalitarian governments typically assign a more important role to collective entities than to individuals. The same might be said of unofficial pressure groups from the left or the right, including the bullies of groupthink encountered on social media, in journalism, in parliament, in universities, and elsewhere. So-called cancel culture is preferred to open discussion. This attitude has been well labeled coercive progressivism. Commandment number 6. The first public obligation is to avoid extremes of suffering. In our world of competing and irreconcilable visions of life, it may sometimes be hard to agree on positive shared goals, though we do need to do this. It's far easier to agree on what we wish to avoid, and at the top of the list comes pain and suffering. A liberalism that stresses the avoidance of these ills above the pursuit of positive goods has been called the liberalism of fear. In the spirit of that liberalism, Berlin wrote, the first public obligation is to avoid extremes of suffering. We may take the risk of drastic action in personal life or in public policy, but we must always be aware that we may be mistaken, that certainty about the effect of such measures invariably leads to avoidable suffering of the innocent. The best that can be done, as a general rule, is to maintain a precarious equilibrium that will prevent the occurrence of desperate situations, of moderate choices. That is the first requirement of a decent society. A certain humility in these matters is very necessary. Commandment number 7, thou shalt not commit a social science. This wording comes from W.H. Auden, who wrote in a 1946 poem, thou shalt not sit with statisticians nor commit a social science. But it is a good formulation of Berlin's 7th commandment, which is based on his rejection of scientism. Scientism is the claim that science is the model for all forms of inquiry, that only the scientific method can establish truth. But for Berlin, the humanities, including politics, are radically different from the natural sciences. Their aims and methods differ. The humanities study human conduct and experience and draw on a crucial source of information that is irrelevant to natural science, namely our own experience of purposive behavior. Humanists seek insight into particular events and people, when scientists look for general rules. Far from being the poor relation of science, the humanities offer a deeper and richer form of understanding and knowledge. We study physical nature from outside, human nature from inside. This means that it is a cardinal error to ape science when we wish fully to understand human beings. Berlin wrote, what scientific method can achieve, it must, of course, be used to achieve. Anything that statistical methods or computers or any other instrument or method fruitful in the natural sciences can do to classify, analyze, predict or retrodict human behavior should, of course, be welcomed. However, it is a far cry from this to the dogmatic assurance that the more the subject matter of an inquiry can be assimilated to that of a natural science, the nearer the truth we shall come. COVID planners take note. Number 8, thou shalt never sacrifice living human beings to abstractions. This is a principle that goes right back to Berlin's witnessing of the first Russian Revolution in Petrograd in 1917. He saw a Tsarist policeman being dragged off by a mob to his death and recoiled in horror. From that day forward, he had a visceral antipathy to political violence, to the sacrifice of real people today in the name of an imaginary state of future felicity. It was a tragic mistake for him to prioritize an unknown future over a known present. To do so breaks several Berlinian commandments, but none more than this one. He expressed it memorably. The one thing that we may be sure of is the reality of the sacrifice, the dying and the dead. But the ideal for the sake of which they die remains unrealized. The eggs are broken and the habit of breaking them grows, but the omelette remains invisible. Sacrifices for short-term goals. Coercion, if men's plight is desperate enough and truly requires such measures, may be justified. But holocausts for the sake of distant goals, that is a cruel mockery of all that men hold dear, now and at all times. The choice of the term Holocaust is not accidental. In our world, where fanatics terrorize free societies in the name of an allegedly single true creed, and dictators force their subjects into conformity with a repressive ideology, these are real, live considerations. Berlin's hero, the 19th century Russian social thinker Alexander Herzen, wrote a sentence which serves as a perfect antidote to the neglect of this commandment. The purpose of life is life. What we do is justified in the here and now, not in terms of some mystical, distant goal. Number 9, thou shalt not treat other people merely as a means to an end. This is a commandment derived from Kant and thoroughly endorsed by Berlin. It is also linked to the golden rule: do as you would be done by. In a letter to a friend, Berlin expressed his horror of the neglect of this commandment by oppressors who imprison their victims. The jailer knows what he is doing and why, and plays upon the victim. That is, treats him as a mere object and not as a subject whose motives, views, intentions have any intrinsic weight whatever. By destroying the very possibility of his having views, notions of a relevant kind, that is what cannot be borne at all. He was thinking here of the Nazi concentration camps in the Second World War. Jesus of Nazareth gave priority to 2 commandments. First, the injunction to love God, and secondly, his version of the present Berlinian commandment. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these 2 commandments, he said, hang all the law and the prophets. If I had to choose 2 of Berlin's commandments to speak of in this way, I should nominate this as one of them. And number 2, the rejection of monism, as the other. And finally, number 10, thou shalt always think for thyself. Taking this commandment at its word, I say no more about it, but I hope leave the last word to Berlin himself.
Thank you.
Henry, thank you very much indeed. That was a marvellous lecture. And we're very much in your debt, of course, not just for that lecture and the preparation which draws so many strands together, but also for the fact that over many years, knowing Isaiah Berlin and having his agreement that he would put material together, you have enabled many of us to learn his ideas, to think about them, and indeed, I hope very much, and today will contribute to this, promulgating these ideas to others. For although they're his ideas, they're even more fundamental than that. He was, as you quite rightly said, knowledgeable about and understanding of the human condition, and his ideas were very much based on this. So we're very much in your debt, and I think we're going to be even more in your debt, because I think that this lecture and the script from the lecture is going to prove both educational and also very popular amongst liberal colleagues who often find it difficult to put into words the things that they instinctively feel to be right. And I think you've done that for us in a really beautiful and attractive way today. So thank you very much indeed for that. And thank you also for agreeing for us to have a little bit of a conversation about some of these things and to explore them further. You were, and I think you regard yourself in this way too, fortunate to have known Isaiah Berlin and to have had his agreement for you to work with his material and to make it available. Can you tell us a little bit about how you first came to know him?
Yes, I first met him at in a house in North Oxford, which was the temporary office for a new college that had been created, a new graduate college called Wolfson College. I wanted to read philosophy at graduate level and applied to various colleges, of which Wolfson was one. And so I arrived and went into the room and was immediately transfixed by this man who was bubbling over with conversation and ideas. I mean, he just struck me straight away as somebody quite unlike anybody I'd ever met before, and a wonderful sort of conveyor of enthusiasm for thought, if you like. It sounds absurd to say so in a way, but I've never met anybody at all like it. He just loved talking about ideas and going off on great riffs of imagination about where they led to and what they conflicted with and so on. It's impossible to convey it in any other way than by inviting you to look at one of the recordings of him speaking, which luckily are numerous.
He was no dry intellectual. He was a very passionate, enthusiastic man.
Absolutely. Terrifically passionate, yes. Both in person and intellectually.
And he enjoyed people.
He enjoyed people. People were what interested him above all. He quoted a German Jewish poet who said, "People are my landscape." That was his basic principle of enjoyment, if you like. He was much more interested in looking at people than at looking at mountains.
And indeed, he seems to have been more interested in relating with people and having conversations and so on, rather than actually getting all of his ideas published. Had it not been for you, we might not have known some of them.
Yes, he was terminally indolent as an academic. He used to say to his secretary when they'd finished gossiping about things for the first hour or so of the day, "Now I suppose we have to do some work." And yet, for somebody who had that temperament, it's extraordinary how much he wrote, or perhaps one should say how much he said, because as his life progressed, more and more of his writings began life by being spoken into a recording machine of one kind or another. He wrote his first book in the 1930s, which was a biography of Karl Marx. But after that, most things began by being dictated. It's extraordinary to read, for example, the first dictated draft of his famous inaugural lecture on two concepts of liberty, which is completely coherent and persuasive and nicely written. He had the capacity to speak perfectly formed sentences, perfectly sequenced arguments, without going through and crossing them out and changing all the time.
A very different thing from many leading politicians nowadays, where it's all worked through and through and through.
Exactly.
They use the auto cue and so on.
Exactly. Yes, and talk to the spin doctors. Nobody could be less spin doctored than him.
And how did it come then that you started to take on this responsibility for, in a way, helping him to put some of his ideas into print and have them published?
Well, as you said earlier, I was extremely lucky. I mean, I have this rather peculiar temperament, this taste for editorial work, which must be a fairly rare thing for people to suffer from, but it's certainly a condition I suffer from. I've always liked creating magazines and getting disorganized collections of material and tidying it up and putting it into order and bringing it out in a way that's easy to assimilate. So I could easily have spent my life just as a publisher's copy editor or something of that kind. But I met this man, and it became clear that here was, in a way, the dream subject, the dream victim for somebody of my temperament. And I started reading his work, and I was as impressed by his work as I was by his person. And it became clearer and clearer as I read on that there was just a massive material that he had no intention of ever doing anything with. Some of it had been published in odd, obscure places. Some of it was just sitting in his house in the cellar as typescripts of lectures or whatever. And so I asked him if I could prepare an edition of his works, in the first place by bringing together all the things that had been published but not collected into thematic volumes, and subsequently to publish a lot of the unpublished material. And after a certain amount of hesitation, he did say yes, and that's the start of the whole process.
Well, it was extraordinary because although he could produce all of this material, unless it could be got out to people, it wasn't going to have the kind of impact. So you've done, both him and all of us, an extraordinary service by this aptitude that you have for putting the material together. But you were saying that he was quite a passionate, quite an emotional man. That may have made things difficult to deal with at times.
Yes, I don't know that I would say it was his passionate or emotional side which created problems for me, although it might have created problems elsewhere in his life. It was more that he was willful and perhaps a bit selfish about what he wanted to happen. I mean, he would allow me to undertake a particular course of action or to put together a particular volume. And then in one case, when I got to the end of the process several months later, he said, I don't think I want this one published at all. And so we had to have a long argument about that and appeal to a friend of his. And in the end, he changed his mind back again. But it was like riding a roller coaster. You know, I was always afraid that the ground would be swept away from under me at any moment and the whole year of work would be wasted. But in the end, he did finally agree to most of the things I asked. And I think he was grateful for what I did, but it was hard to perceive the gratitude amidst the grumbles sometimes.
And in the end, you have the last laugh because you survived longer and are able to continue publishing.
Yes, I've been able to happily to publish after his death a lot of the material which he wouldn't have allowed me to publish in his lifetime, rightly in a way, because he felt that if he was to allow it to appear in his lifetime, he ought to do more work on it. So I've been able to publish unscripted lectures and so forth. And I think in many ways that's a good thing because they come across as very vivid, very engaged, very excited performances at the lectern rather than as more considered, more polished academic pieces of writing which some of his other work might be seen as. So I think we've got a nice mix in the final oeuvre of academic, careful writing on the one hand and extempore, excited, bubbling performances in the lecture theatre on the other.
One of the reasons that I was so keen and I'm now so delighted that you gave the lecture and gave it this year is that this is the 20th anniversary of the first Isaiah Berlin lecture, which was given by Charles Kennedy, who was the leader of the Liberal Democrats at that time. And Charles also gave a very brilliant lecture and one that spoke about Isaiah Berlin himself. Not all the Isaiah Berlin lectures have spoken so much about Isaiah Berlin, and Isaiah Berlin's widow and family were very supportive, both of that lecture and of subsequent lectures. So I'm delighted that we're able to spend some time with you exploring it. But one of the comments that Charles made in that lecture was that Isaiah Berlin was less known than some other liberal thinkers to politicians in the liberal tradition, because he didn't get involved in politics in the way that Keynes or Beveridge or some of these other liberal thinkers did. Have you any thoughts about why he didn't get involved more politically? I don't mean necessarily standing for Parliament, although people like John Stuart Mill did do things like that. But have you any thoughts about why he didn't engage in politics in a direct way?
Well, his own account is the best way to answer that. I think he wrote to his father in early life a sentence which seems remarkable when you consider what he later went on to do and to write, which is, "I am not a very political thinker." That seems counterintuitive in a way, but later on he would say something also which clarified this a bit. I think he said, "I'm not terribly interested in day-to-day politics, the kind of things that comes in the Times in the morning and so on," although he would read the paper a great deal. He said, "I am more interested in the more permanent characteristics of the human condition," adding, if that isn't too pompous a thing to say. So he really was, I think, as I tried to convey, trying to dig deeper than the ephemera of daily politics into the formative questions that perhaps were unspoken a lot of the time, but nevertheless answers to which lay at the root of different political attitudes. So he was more of a political theorist, if you like, than a political practitioner, which is a perfectly reasonable division of labour. Some people have criticised him for what you've just described, but I don't see a problem with it.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and in a way, it's become a problem of modern politics, in a way, if I can put it in that way. In this building where we're recording the National Liberal Club, it was built by Gladstone and his colleagues. And of course, Gladstone himself was an extraordinary author and reader. His library contains some 40,000 books, and we know that he read a lot of these because he actually wrote little notes about, Disraeli says this, obviously nonsense, or whatever, So he was a thinker, and he used to send books, including big theological tomes, to members of his cabinet and say, "Please do tell me what you think of this." I mean, one can't imagine these kinds of things happening now.
No.
But of course, one of the differences was that there wasn't a 24-hour news cycle.
No.
You weren't all the time addressing all sorts of constituency problems of that minutiae. And nowadays, politicians feel that even if they're very senior politicians, they have to address all these detailed issues. And I think it's very difficult then, sometimes, for them to pull back and address these wider questions. And I think it's interesting you describe it as a useful division of labour. I think it is. And one of the things that's attractive about Isaiah Berlin and his work is that while many political scientists seem to write and think in a way which is divorced not just from practical politics but from real politics and how things actually are, Isaiah Berlin's ideas seem very easily, when we listen to you giving the 10 Commandments there, it's very easy to see, even, for example, how they apply to running a country in the middle of a pandemic. How should you conduct that? And you describe how you need to help people to understand. You don't just order people to do things because they need to understand, to cooperate with you, and so on. Are there any ways that you can see where we could try to help people of all ages and stages understand how to think about these kinds of principles of human behaviour rather than just abandon them to people who are interested in either philosophy or the history of ideas?
Well, I think one depends on figures. I call Berlin a public intellectual. One depends upon people of that kind to give their time to try to explain the principles behind useful political thinking. But the trouble with the modern media, which is the platform upon which such things would have to happen, is that it's been increasingly fragmented by the need for short sound bites. And we all must have experienced the frustration of listening to an interview where the interviewer jumps into the first sentence of the answer and says, "but X, Y, and Z," and without letting the person finish the reply. So I think that the conditions, the sort of conditions of engagement for public intellectuals these days have got infinitely more difficult than they used to be. And one hopes that somehow there may be some return of what used to take place on, for example, the third programme or Radio 3. We do occasionally, there are one or two people who still get slots on something like, what's it called? There's a quarter of an hour thing called A Time for Thought, or A Thought of the Day or something. John Gray is somebody, I think, who's a sort of quasi-liberal thinker of a kind, who has some little set pieces of that kind. And we need more of that kind of thing. We need more slots where people who are both serious thinkers and have the capacity to communicate with the general public can be given a platform, and there isn't enough of it at the moment.
I have a feeling that you're right. Actually, one of the things that seems to be happening is that because of the accessibility of social media, there are those little clips, the kind of Twitter feed stuff. But there are also opportunities for people to produce blogs and video blogs that enable more substantial conversations to take place.
That is true. Yes, and we both know a man in Ireland who has a YouTube channel on which he has quite relaxed, lengthy interviews with what he calls thinkers, which includes apparently both yourself and myself. We've both taken part in this. I think that's exactly the kind of enterprise which I would suggest in reply to your previous question.
Well, yes, you're right. This is Johnny Lyons, and who wrote an excellent introduction to the thinking of Isaiah Berlin too.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, and your comments kind of takes me back to Ireland, one of the things which strikes me very much about Berlin from my own experience is this opposition to what you call monism, the notion that there is one answer. Because, of course, in the context of Northern Ireland, each side of the community believed they had the one answer.
Of course, yeah.
And any resolution was going to have to be a pluralist resolution, which said, well, I understand you have your views, and I understand you have your views. We have to construct a political settlement which will respect both and enable you to pursue both, not as a mixture of the two, but as particular ideas. And that leads me to, I'm going to let us at that stage to a different kind of political structure, but it leads me to the question of whether you think that Berlin himself had any kind of ideas or thoughts about what kind of political structures or institutions might more represent the pluralism that he thought was so essential, and which I think he was absolutely right about. The Westminster system tended to allow one set to be in charge now and another set to be in charge at another time. Did he ever talk at all, or write at all, about how political institutions might develop in a way that would more express and resemble his own ideas about pluralism?
I'm sorry to say that the answer to that question is no. That's one of the most notable criticisms of him, similar to one I was talking about just now. There's a man called Jeremy Waldron, who was a successor to Berlin in an Oxford professorship, who wrote a very swingeing attack on him for not thinking about or writing about political institutions on the grounds, which are implicit in what you've just asked, that unless you get your institutions right, you can't get your politics right. But I've always resisted that attack on Berlin on division of labour grounds. That's to say, there are people who study the institutions, there are people who study the political ideas, and although the two are related and one is there to put the others into practice, you don't have to be equally absorbed and obsessed by each at the same time. I mean, maybe I'm being too easy on him. Maybe he should have taken more interest in institutions, but he didn't write about them almost at all.
I think you're right not to be hard on him in that regard, as you say, because it seems to me that sometimes as liberals we get so caught up in the institutions and structures that we forget that what is actually essential is the spirit. And if you have that spirit of not just liberty, but also liberality, so freedom and also generosity of spirit, then it's up to those who are involved in the practical politics to recall and remember and celebrate the principles, but to find ways of working them out. If you've not been involved in the practice of politics, it may well be that it would be quite difficult to suggest realistic institutions. So, like you, I don't regard it as a criticism of Berlin. I think he has provided us with something, but you have also provided us with a way into his thinking. And I think for me, the responsibility now lies with practical political colleagues around the world in Liberal International to take up those ideas and principles and find ways of applying them to the development of liberal democracy, which is under pressure, without a doubt. But if we hold to some of the ideas and principles that he set down and you have laid out for us today, we have not just a challenge, but actually an exciting possibility for all of us. And I want to thank you very much again for helping us in this way. Thank you very much indeed.